It was just another Wednesday afternoon in the peaceful neighborhood of Pine Grove. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the neat suburban streets lined with maple trees. Michael, a 16-year-old high school junior, was walking home from his robotics club, his backpack heavy with textbooks and the latest project he'd been working on. A small drone designed to help first responders during emergencies. Michael wasn't just any student, he was the kind of kid who made his parents proud without even trying. His report cards were filled with A's, and his bedroom walls were covered with science fair medals and academic achievement certificates. But more than his grades, it was his kind heart that set him apart. He was always the first to help younger students with their homework or volunteer at the local community center during weekends. That day, he'd stayed late at school to perfect his drone's navigation system. His robotics teacher, Mr. Wilson, had even skipped his own lunch break to help Michael fine-tune the programming. "This could save lives one day," Mr. Wilson had said, patting Michael on the shoulder. Those words kept replaying in Michael's mind as he walked home, a small smile playing on his lips. He was wearing his school uniform, a neat blue blazer with the school crest, gray slacks, and polished black shoes. His mother always insisted on ironing his uniform herself, saying, "Presentation matters, son." In his hands, he carefully carried the drone prototype, wrapped in protective bubble wrap. The familiar route home took him past Mrs. Chen's flower shop, where she was watering the outdoor displays. She always gave him a friendly wave, sometimes even offering him a bottle of water or a cookie. Today, she was too busy arguing with her delivery guy about some mixed-up orders, but Michael could smell the fresh roses as he passed by. Everything seemed normal until he heard the police siren's short burst behind him. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars often patrolled the neighborhood, and he'd never had any trouble before. But this time was different. The patrol car pulled up beside him, and Officer Reynolds stepped out, his hand already resting on his belt. Something about the officer's stance made Michael's stomach twist into knots. This wasn't like Officer Thompson, who sometimes visited their school for career day and played basketball with the kids. Officer Reynolds had only recently transferred to their precinct, and there was something cold in his eyes that made Michael instinctively take a step back. "Stop right there," Officer Reynolds barked, his voice harsh against the quiet afternoon air. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Michael's heart started racing, but he remembered what his parents had always taught him about staying calm and respectful. "Good afternoon, officer," he said clearly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just walking home from school. I can show you my student ID." But Officer Reynolds wasn't interested in Michael's explanation. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the fallen autumn leaves. "Put down what you're carrying." Slowly, he commanded, pointing at the wrapped drone. "Sir, this is just my robotics project," Michael tried to explain, carefully holding up the wrapped package. "It's for the state science competition next month. I can unwrap it right here to show you." I said, "Put it down." Officer Reynolds' voice had risen to a shout now, causing Mrs. Chen to look up from her flowers, her watering frozen mid-pour. Michael's hands were shaking as he gently placed his project on the ground. His mind was racing. What had he done wrong? He was just walking home, the same way he did every day. He could see more people starting to notice what was happening. Mr. Parker, who was washing his car in his driveway, had stopped and was now holding his phone up, recording everything. "Listen, officer," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly but still maintaining its politeness. "My parents are expecting me home. My dad's a teacher at Roosevelt High, and my mom works at City General Hospital. I can call them right now." But before he could reach for his phone, Officer Reynolds had grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into Michael's wrists as the officer roughly detained him, ignoring his protests and the growing crowd of concerned neighbors. All Michael could think about was his drone project lying on the sidewalk, vulnerable to damage, and how he was supposed to help his little sister with her math homework that evening. The unfairness of it all made his throat tight, but he remembered his father's words. "Sometimes, son, the world isn't fair. But how you handle unfairness shows who you really are." So he stayed calm, even as Officer Reynolds pushed him toward the patrol car, even as Mrs. Chen shouted that she was calling Michael's parents, even as more phones came out to record the incident. He kept his dignity, repeatedly stating in a clear voice, "I'm a student. I was just walking home from school. This is a mistake." The sun continued to set over Pine Grove, casting everything in a surreal golden light. The peaceful Wednesday afternoon had turned into something else entirely, a moment that would soon spark a movement bigger than anyone could have imagined. The ride to the police station was the longest 15 minutes of Michael's life. Through the patrol car's window, he watched his familiar neighborhood streets slip away, trying to keep his breathing steady. His wrists hurt from the tight handcuffs, but what hurt more was seeing his robotics project left behind on the sidewalk, months of hard work just abandoned there on the concrete. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Reynolds roughly guided Michael through the processing. The teenager kept his voice clear and respectful, even as his heart pounded against his ribs. "I'd like to call my parents, please," he said for what felt like the 100th time. But Officer Reynolds acted like he couldn't hear him, focusing instead on filling out paperwork with angry pen strokes. Other officers in the station gave curious looks. One of them, an older officer with gray hair at his temples, frowned as he watched Reynolds process the clearly well-dressed student. "Hey Reynolds," he called out, "what's the charge here?" Suspicious behavior and resisting arrest, Reynolds snapped back, not looking up from his papers. Michael noticed how the older officer's frown deepened at that response. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, things were far from quiet. Mrs. Chen, the flower shop owner, had indeed called Michael's parents, and she hadn't stopped there. She posted the video of the arrest on her social media accounts, her hands shaking with anger as she typed out what she'd witnessed. Mr. Parker, still holding his car washing sponge, had done the same with his footage. "I've known that boy since he was in elementary school," Mrs. Chen told anyone who would listen, standing in her doorway with tears in her eyes. "He helps me carry heavy flower deliveries every Thursday after school. He's a good kid, one of the best." At City General Hospital, Michael's mom was in the middle of updating a patient's chart when her phone started buzzing with messages. The moment she saw the video, she dropped everything, her face turning pale. Within minutes, she was running out of the hospital, still in her white coat, calling her husband and their family lawyer simultaneously. Michael's father was in the middle of grading papers when he got the call. The red pen he was holding fell from his fingers, leaving a small mark on one student's essay as he listened to his wife's voice crack with emotion. He stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward, startling his colleague in the teacher's lounge. Back at the station, Michael sat on a hard plastic chair, his school blazer wrinkled, his tie slightly askew. He could hear Officer Reynolds arguing with someone in another room, their voices rising and falling. Words like procedure and protocol drifted through the thin walls. Then suddenly, everything seemed to happen at once. The station's front doors burst open, and Michael's parents rushed in, followed by their family lawyer, Mr. Thompson. Michael's mother's white coat billowed behind her like a cape as she ran to her son. His father's usually calm face was tight with controlled anger. "Don't say another word, Michael," Mr. Thompson advised quickly, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. He turned to face Officer Reynolds, who had emerged from the other room. "I'm requesting immediate release of my client. I'm also formally notifying you that we'll be filing a complaint regarding this unlawful arrest." The station's atmosphere had changed completely. Other officers were now paying close attention, especially when Mr. Thompson mentioned that he had already received multiple videos of the incident from concerned citizens. One of these officers, Lieutenant Clark, stepped forward, her badge glinting under the harsh lighting. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice crisp and professional, "my office. Now." Then she turned to Michael and his family, her tone softening slightly. "We'll have your son's release paperwork processed immediately. And I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated." As Michael's handcuffs were finally removed, he rubbed his sore wrists, fighting back tears as his mother hugged him tightly. Through the station's windows, he could see that the sun had fully set now. News vans were starting to pull up outside, their satellite dishes reaching up into the darkening sky like metal trees. His father's phone kept buzzing, messages from other teachers, students, community members, all sharing the videos, all expressing their shock and support. The family lawyer was already talking about body camera footage, about filing formal complaints, about making sure this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. But all Michael could think about was his robotics project, wondering if it was still lying there on the sidewalk or if someone had picked it up. All those hours of work, all those dreams of helping first responders. He didn't know it yet, but that project and this terrible afternoon would end up having a bigger impact than he could have ever imagined. As they finally walked out of the station, cameras flashing in the darkness, Michael stood tall between his parents. He might have been scared, but he wasn't broken. Something had changed in him during those hours in the station. A determination had taken root. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about making sure no other kid would have to go through what he had experienced while simply walking home from school. By the next morning, Pine Grove wasn't just a quiet suburb anymore. It had become the center of a storm. The videos of Michael's arrest had spread like wildfire across social media, and people weren't staying quiet. The comfortable silence that usually blanketed the neighborhood was replaced by the buzz of urgent conversations and the hum of news vans parked along the streets. Mrs. Chen's flower shop had turned into an unofficial community meeting spot. People kept coming in, not for flowers, but to share what they'd seen and to ask how they could help. She'd set up a small table with free coffee and her famous homemade cookies, while residents from all over town gathered to talk about what had happened to our boy. "I watched that child grow up," she told a local reporter, wiping tears from her eyes with her soil-stained apron. "Every day, he walks past my shop with a smile and a wave. Sometimes he helps me move the heavy plant pots without me even asking. That's the kind of person he is." At Roosevelt High School, where Michael's father taught history, the hallways were filled with whispers and worried faces. Students who had never said more than hello to Michael were now wearing handmade badges with messages of support. His robotics team had launched a social media campaign #StandWithMichael that was gaining traction by the hour. The best news came early that morning. Mr. Parker, the neighbor who had been washing his car, had rescued Michael's drone project from the sidewalk. He'd kept it safe overnight and personally delivered it to Michael's house before heading to work. The protective bubble wrap was a bit torn, but the drone itself was undamaged, a small victory in the midst of everything else. Michael's living room had turned into what looked like a command center. His mother had taken the day off from the hospital, and their dining table was covered with papers, printouts of laws about unlawful arrest, citizens' rights documents, and statements from witnesses. Their family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, practically moved in, his laptop becoming a permanent fixture on their coffee table. "The community response is unprecedented," Mr. Thompson explained, scrolling through endless messages of support. "I've handled civil rights cases before, but I've never seen anything quite like this. People are tired of seeing this happen. They're ready for change." The local civil rights organizations had reached out, offering support and resources. But what touched Michael's family the most were the small gestures from their neighbors. Someone had mowed their lawn without being asked. Others kept dropping off home-cooked meals. Ms. Rodriguez from 3 houses down brought over her famous empanadas, saying only, "You have enough to worry about without thinking about cooking." Michael sat quietly on his front porch that afternoon, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He watched as another news van slowly drove by, its reporter probably hoping to catch an interview. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from classmates and friends, all asking if he was okay, all offering their support. That's when he noticed a group of younger kids from the neighborhood standing at the edge of his yard, looking unsure whether to come closer. One of them, a small boy he recognized from the community center where he volunteered, was holding a handmade card. Michael waved them over, managing a small smile. "We made this for you," the boy said, handing over the card covered in wobbly letters and colorful drawings. "My big sister explained what happened. It's not fair." Michael opened the card to find dozens of messages from the kids at the community center. "You're our hero," one read. "Thank you for being brave," said another. His vision blurred with tears as he read each message, realizing that what happened to him had affected so many people, even the youngest ones. Inside the house, Michael's parents were on a conference call with other community leaders, discussing next steps. They could hear fragments of the conversation, words like accountability, reform, and change. His mother's voice was strong and clear as she spoke about the need for better police training and community engagement. The police department had released a brief statement saying they were investigating the incident, but people wanted more than just words. Officer Reynolds had been placed on administrative leave, but for the community, that wasn't enough. They wanted systemic change, real reform that would prevent this from happening to anyone else. As the sun began to set on that second day, Michael finally opened his laptop to work on his drone project. His hands shook slightly as he typed, but his determination was stronger than ever. The drone's purpose, helping first responders better serve the community, felt even more important now. Maybe, he thought, this is how change starts. Not just with big protests and news stories, but with small things too. With neighbors helping neighbors. With kids making cards. With someone saving a school project from a sidewalk. With people coming together to say, this isn't right, and we won't let it happen again. Outside his window, he could see Mrs. Chen closing up her flower shop for the day. She'd put a new sign in her window, Community Strong. Somehow, those two simple words summed up everything that had happened since yesterday. The wrongful arrest hadn't broken their community. It had made it stronger, more united, more determined to fight for what was right. The police department's internal affairs division didn't know what hit them. By the end of the week, their normally quiet offices were buzzing with activity. Lieutenant Clark sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files, her coffee long gone cold. She'd been digging through Officer Reynolds' record since dawn, and what she found made her stomach turn. This isn't his first incident, she told the police chief, spreading out documents across his desk. There's a pattern here that somebody should have caught years ago. The chief's face grew darker as he flipped through page after page of complaints from Reynolds' previous precinct, all somehow buried, all somehow overlooked. But the most damaging evidence came from Reynolds' own body camera. The tech team had recovered the full footage, including the parts where he tried to disable the audio. The camera had caught everything: his aggressive approach, Michael's polite responses, and most importantly, the complete lack of any reasonable cause for the arrest. Meanwhile, at the high school, Michael's robotics teacher, Mr. Wilson, had taken action in his own way. He'd compiled years of Michael's academic records, certificates, and project documentation. Look at this, he said, pointing to Michael's perfect attendance record and volunteer hours. This is who Officer Reynolds decided was suspicious. A kid who spends his free time building drones to help emergency workers. The local news couldn't get enough of the story. But it wasn't just about Michael anymore. Other people started coming forward with their own stories about Officer Reynolds. A college student described being harassed while waiting for a bus. An elderly man talked about being roughly treated while walking his dog. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. At home, Michael was trying to keep up with his schoolwork, but it wasn't easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel those handcuffs. His mother noticed how he flinched at sudden noises, how he'd stopped taking his usual route home. She found him one night, sitting in the dark, just staring at his drone project. "You know," she said, sitting beside him, "it's okay to not be okay right now." She wrapped an arm around his shoulders, and finally he let himself cry, not the quiet tears from before, but deep, shoulder-shaking sobs that had been building up all week. The investigation took an unexpected turn when a rookie officer came forward with screenshots of Reynolds' social media posts. Posts filled with prejudice, with hate, with everything a police officer shouldn't stand for. Lieutenant Clark added them to her growing file, her lips pressed into a thin line. The police chief called an emergency meeting with the city council. The mayor was there, along with community leaders and civil rights attorneys. They sat around a large table, watching body camera footage that showed Reynolds turning off his audio, showed him ignoring Michael's rights, showed everything they needed to see. "This ends now," the mayor said, her voice firm. "We're not just talking about one bad officer anymore. We're talking about a system that let this happen. That stops today." Back in the neighborhood, life had developed a new rhythm. People walked in groups more often. Neighbors kept their phones ready to record any police interaction they saw. Mrs. Chen had started a neighborhood watch program, with dozens of residents signing up to help keep their community safe. Michael's drone project had evolved too. Working late into the night, he'd added new features, ways to record and transmit video, ways to help document incidents like the one he'd experienced. His robotics team helped, each member bringing new ideas, new possibilities. "See, that's what they didn't understand about you," Mr. Wilson told him during one late-night work session. "They saw what they wanted to see, but you took something terrible and turned it into something that could help others. That's real strength." The investigation was reaching its conclusion. Lieutenant Clark had compiled a report so thorough it couldn't be ignored. Officer Reynolds' previous precinct was now under investigation too, their records being pulled, their procedures being questioned. One morning, Michael's family gathered in their living room with Mr. Thompson, their lawyer. He had news from the department. Reynolds had been suspended without pay, pending termination. But more importantly, the department was implementing new training programs, new oversight measures, new ways to prevent this from happening again. "Your son's case," Mr. Thompson explained, "it's becoming a turning point. Other departments are already requesting copies of our documentation, wanting to learn from what happened here." Michael sat quietly, listening to all this. He thought about that afternoon, about how quickly everything had changed. He thought about his drone project, still sitting on his desk, waiting to be finished. He thought about all the people who had stood up for him, who had refused to stay silent. "Maybe," he said finally, speaking up during a pause in the conversation, "we could help train new officers. Show them my drone project, explain how it's meant to help people. Show them that's what real police work should be about, helping people, not hurting them." His parents exchanged looks, and his father smiled. "That's my boy," he said softly, "always thinking about how to make things better." Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Mrs. Chen was opening her flower shop, now decorated with signs about community unity. Kids were walking to school in groups, looking out for each other. And somewhere in the police department, Lieutenant Clark was adding the final pages to her report, pages that would help ensure no other kid would have to go through what Michael did just for walking home from school. The courthouse steps were crowded that morning. Everyone from Pine Grove seemed to be there. Teachers, students, neighbors, even Mrs. Chen, who'd closed her flower shop for the day. They'd all watched as Michael walked up those steps with his parents and Mr. Thompson, their lawyer. He walked tall, his school tie perfectly straight, carrying a folder full of documents they'd spent weeks preparing. Inside the courtroom, everything felt different. The wooden benches were hard and uncomfortable, and the air conditioning hummed too loudly. Michael sat between his parents, trying not to look at Officer Reynolds, who sat on the other side with his own lawyer. Instead, he focused on the judge, an older woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. The evidence was overwhelming. Mr. Thompson presented it piece by piece, like putting together a puzzle that showed the whole truth. First came the neighbors' videos, playing on the courtroom screens. Then the body camera footage, showing how Reynolds had tried to hide what he was doing. The social media posts. The previous complaints. The testimony from other victims who'd faced similar treatment. But what really caught everyone's attention was when Michael's robotics teacher took the stand. Mr. Wilson had brought Michael's drone project with him, now completed and ready to demonstrate. "This," he said, holding up the drone, "is what Officer Reynolds saw as suspicious. A device designed to help first responders save lives, built by a student who spent countless hours trying to make his community safer." The courtroom fell silent as Mr. Wilson explained how the drone worked, how it could help in emergency situations. Even the judge leaned forward, interested. Michael watched as Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat, finally seeing what he'd been too prejudiced to notice that day, just a kid trying to make a difference. During a break in the proceedings, Michael stood in the courthouse hallway, sipping from a water fountain. A young police cadet approached him, looking nervous. "I just wanted you to know," the cadet said quietly, "that using your case in our training now, teaching us what not to do, how to be better." Back inside, Michael's mother took the stand. She spoke about the night of the arrest, about rushing to the police station, about how her son had changed since that day. "He still flinches when a police car drives by," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But he also still works on his drone project. He still wants to help people. That's who my son is, someone who chooses to make things better, even after being treated so unfairly." The city's police chief testified next, admitting to the department's failures, but also outlining the changes being made. New training programs, better screening of officers, regular reviews of body camera footage, community oversight committees. What happened to Michael, he said, opened our eyes to problems we should have seen long ago. Lieutenant Clark's testimony was particularly powerful. She walked the court through her investigation, showing how Reynolds' pattern of behavior had been overlooked for years. The system failed, she said bluntly. It failed Michael, it failed our community, and it failed the good officers who wear the badge with honor. During lunch break, Michael sat on a bench outside the courthouse, watching people come and go. A group of younger kids from his neighborhood had set up a small stand nearby, selling lemonade to raise money for the new community oversight program. They waved at him, and he waved back, managing a small smile. When it was Michael's turn to testify, he spoke clearly and calmly about what happened that day. He described his walk home from school, the robotics project, Officer Reynolds' approach. He explained how it felt to be handcuffed for no reason, to be treated like a criminal while just walking home. But he also talked about what happened afterward, how his community had come together, how people had supported each other, how they turned anger into action. The judge listened carefully to everyone, taking notes, asking questions. When Officer Reynolds finally took the stand, his excuses sounded hollow. He tried to justify his actions, but the evidence was too clear, the truth too obvious. As the day drew to a close, the courthouse steps were still crowded. News cameras pointed at the doors, waiting for the outcome. Inside, the judge delivered her decision, one that would affect not just Michael and Officer Reynolds, but police departments across the country. This case, she said, looking directly at Michael, shows us both the worst and the best of our community. The worst in how an officer abused his power, but the best in how people came together to demand change. The ruling was comprehensive. Officer Reynolds would be terminated, his police license revoked. The department would pay damages and implement all proposed reforms. But more importantly, the case would become required reading for police cadets nationwide, a lesson in what happens when power is abused and how communities can come together to fight injustice. Outside, as the sun set behind the courthouse, Michael stood surrounded by his supporters. Mrs. Chen hugged him, crying happy tears. His robotics team was already talking about their next project, using this experience to design even better ways to help their community. The young kids with their lemonade stand cheered, not fully understanding everything but knowing something important had happened. "You did it," his father said softly, squeezing his shoulder. But Michael shook his head. "We did it," he corrected, looking at all the faces around him. "Everyone here did it, and we're not done yet." He was right. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of real change. 6 months after the courthouse ruling, Pine Grove had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The small police station where Michael had once sat handcuffed now looked completely different. The walls were covered with community artwork, and the front desk had been redesigned to be more welcoming. But the real changes went much deeper than just appearances. Every morning, new police cadets gathered in the station's training room, which had been renamed the Community First Center. Today, Michael stood at the front of that room, his drone hovering quietly beside him. He'd been invited to share his story as part of the department's new training program, and though his hands shook a little, his voice was strong. "I'm not here to make you feel bad," he told the room full of fresh-faced cadets. "I'm here to help you do better." He demonstrated how his drone could assist in emergency situations, showing them that the very thing that had made Officer Reynolds suspicious was actually designed to help police officers do their jobs better. The cadets listened intently, taking notes, asking questions. One young officer raised her hand. "What could Officer Reynolds have done differently that day?" she asked. The room grew quiet, waiting for Michael's answer. "He could have just talked to me," Michael replied simply. "Asked about my day, about my project. Treated me like a person, not a threat." The cadets nodded, writing this down, not because they had to, but because they understood its importance. Outside the station, Pine Grove itself had become a model for other communities. The Neighborhood Watch program Mrs. Chen started had expanded into something bigger, a community safety network where neighbors looked out for each other. Her flower shop had become an unofficial community center where residents and police officers often gathered for coffee and conversation. The police department had undergone a complete overhaul. Lieutenant Clark, now promoted to captain, had implemented strict new protocols for officer conduct. Body cameras couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. Regular psychological evaluations became mandatory. But most importantly, officers were required to spend time getting to know the communities they served. Michael's father had helped design a new curriculum for the police academy, focusing on cultural awareness and community relations. It's not enough to teach officers about the law, he explained during a training session. They need to understand the people they're sworn to protect. The changes weren't always easy. Some older officers resisted the new requirements, clinging to old ways of doing things. But the success stories were impossible to ignore. Complaints against officers dropped dramatically. Community trust began to rebuild. Other police departments started sending representatives to learn from Pine Grove's example. One sunny afternoon, Michael walked past his old arrest spot, now transformed into a small community garden. Mrs. Chen's flower shop had donated the first plants, and neighborhood kids took turns watering them. Where he had once stood in handcuffs, some flowers now reached toward the sky. His drone project had evolved too. Working with his robotics team and some forward-thinking police officers, they developed a whole fleet of emergency response drones. Each one was equipped with cameras and first aid delivery capabilities. The project had won several awards and was being implemented by emergency services across the state. At the community center, Michael started a mentoring program for younger kids, teaching them about robotics and their rights. Knowledge is power, he told them, helping a small girl adjust the controls of a practice drone. And so is understanding. The police department's monthly community meetings, once sparsely attended, now packed the local community center. Officers and residents sat together, discussing neighborhood issues, sharing concerns, finding solutions. Today's topic was the expansion of the Youth Outreach Program, which paired officers with local teenagers for mentoring and project collaboration. 6 months ago, Captain Clark addressed the crowded room. We were a department in crisis. Now we're showing others how to do it right. She nodded toward Michael, who sat with his parents near the front. Sometimes it takes a wake-up call to realize we need to change. The question is what we do after we wake up. The mayor had created a permanent civilian oversight committee with members from all parts of the community. They reviewed police conduct, suggested improvements, and ensured transparency. Michael's mother served on the committee, bringing her medical background and personal experience to the role. Local businesses got involved too. The tech company where Mr. Wilson's brother worked donated equipment for the drone program. The coffee shop started a Coffee with a Cop program, creating space for informal conversations between officers and residents. Even the high school added a law and justice course to its curriculum, teaching students about their rights and responsibilities. As Michael walked home from another training session at the station, he passed 2 police officers on patrol. They'd waved at him, and he waved back without hesitation. One of them was a recent graduate from the new training program. "Hey Michael," she called out, "coming to the community basketball game this weekend?" He nodded, smiling. The monthly basketball games between police officers and local teenagers had become a neighborhood highlight. Even Mrs. Chen, who claimed to know nothing about sports, came to cheer everyone on. Later that evening, sitting on his front porch, Michael watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. His drone sat on the table beside him, ready for the next day's demonstration at another police department interested in Pine Grove's reforms. "You've started something big," his father had told him that morning. "Something that's helping people far beyond our neighborhood." Michael thought about that as he watched his neighbors walking by, about how one terrible afternoon had led to so much positive change. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, still minds to change, still improvements to make. But they were moving forward, step by step, person by person, community by community. And that, he realized, was how real change happened. Not all at once, but day by day, with people working together, learning from mistakes, and choosing to do better. The garden where he was arrested continued to grow, the flowers reaching higher each day, turning what was once a place of pain into something beautiful and new. 1 year had passed since that life-changing afternoon. The high school auditorium was packed for graduation day, with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, creating bright patches on the polished floor where soon-to-be graduates would walk. Michael adjusted his graduation cap backstage, his hands slightly shaky. As class valedictorian, he would be giving a speech to the entire school community. His index cards felt heavy in his pocket, though he practiced the words 100 times. In the audience, his parents sat in the front row. His mother wiped tears from her eyes even before the ceremony began, while his father tried to pretend something wasn't stuck in his eye. Mrs. Chen had closed her flower shop early and was there too, proudly holding a bouquet she'd made specially for Michael. Captain Clark sat near the back, along with several other officers who'd become part of the community's transformation. The young cadet who'd first approached Michael at the courthouse was now a full-fledged officer, wearing her badge with a new understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. As the ceremony began, Michael thought about everything that had changed in the past year. His drone project had grown into a full-fledged emergency response program, now being used by police departments across the country. The prototype he'd been carrying that fateful day sat in a display case in the police academy's new training center, serving as both a teaching tool and a reminder. When it was time for his speech, Michael walked to the podium, took a deep breath, and looked out at the sea of faces. Among them were the kids from the community center where he still volunteered, the neighbors who'd stood up for him, and even some of the officers who'd gone through the new training program he'd helped design. "A year ago," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I was just a kid walking home from school. I never expected that walk to change not just my life, but our entire community. But that's the thing about change. It often starts in the most unexpected moments." He paused, looking at his parents, drawing strength from their proud smiles. "We've all heard the saying that when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Well, our community did more than that. We turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. We transformed fear into hope, anger into action, and division into unity." The audience listened intently as Michael spoke about the changes they'd all witnessed. The new police training programs, the community oversight committee, the mentoring programs, the emergency response drones, but most importantly, the way people had come together, refusing to let one incident tear them apart. "Today, when I walk home from school, I see something different," he continued. "I see officers playing basketball with kids in the park. I see Mrs. Chen's flower shop full of people from all walks of life, sharing stories and ideas. I see my drone project helping save lives instead of being seen as suspicious." In the audience, some of his robotics team members nodded. They were wearing special cords with their graduation gowns, recognizing their work on the emergency response program. Their latest prototype had just been approved for use by the state's emergency services. "But the biggest change," Michael said, his voice softening slightly, "isn't in our policies or programs. It's in how we see each other, how we listen to each other, how we stand up for each other." He talked about the garden that now bloomed where he was arrested, how it had become a symbol of transformation, how every flower planted there represented a step toward healing and understanding. The sunflowers had grown taller than anyone expected, their bright faces following the sun just like the community had followed the path toward positive change. "To my fellow graduates," he continued, "we're stepping into a world that needs more than just our diplomas. It needs our courage to stand up for what's right, our creativity to solve problems, our compassion to help others, and most importantly, our willingness to turn difficult moments into opportunities for change." As he spoke these words, he saw the young kids from the community center sitting up straighter in their seats. They'd been coming to his robotics workshops all year, learning not just about technology, but about resilience and determination. "A year ago, I stood in handcuffs because someone chose to see me as a threat instead of a student. Today, I stand here as your valedictorian, not despite what happened, but because of how we all chose to respond to it. We chose unity over division, understanding over ignorance, progress over prejudice." Michael's voice grew stronger as he reached the end of his speech. "As we leave high school today, remember this: change doesn't always come from grand gestures or big movements. Sometimes it starts with one person, one moment, one choice to do better. And when a community comes together, those small changes can transform the world." The applause that followed was deafening. Mrs. Chen was openly crying now, her flowers clutched to her chest. The police officers in attendance stood up, joining the standing ovation. Michael's parents held each other, their faces glowing with pride. After the ceremony, as people gathered in the school courtyard, Michael found himself surrounded by well-wishers. His drone project team showed off their latest prototype to excited onlookers. Captain Clark shook his hand, telling him about another department that wanted to implement their training program. But the moment that touched him most was when a small group of middle school students approached him. "We're starting a robotics club," one of them said shyly. "Would you come talk to us sometimes? Help us learn how to make things that help people." Michael looked at these kids, seeing in them the same hope and potential he carried when walking home that day a year ago. "Of course," he said, smiling. "Because that's what our community does now. We help each other grow, we learn from each other, and we build a better future together." As the sun set on graduation day, casting long shadows across the school grounds, Michael stood with his family and friends, his diploma in one hand and Mrs. Chen's flowers in the other. He looked around at all the faces, the officers who'd learned to serve better, the neighbors who'd stood up for justice, the kids who dreamed of making their own positive changes. This wasn't just an ending, he realized. It was a beginning. For him, for his community, and for everyone who believed that positive change was possible, one step, one person, one day at a time.